Hello everybody, welcome to episode 31 of Film Gold. This is just a very short intro before I cut to the conclusion of my conversation about Orson Welles with David Ghosty Wells. This was meant to be a two-parter, so we didn't record an intro to part 3, so I thought I'd just do that now. I hope you enjoyed the first two parts, and if you have, then I'm sure you're going to enjoy this one as well. I was quite pleased with the phrase Mercurial Magician to describe Orson. At some point in the conversation, we described Orson as mercurial, which he definitely was. And I didn't realise actually it was a pun on Mercury, as in the Mercury Theatre. So that was a bit of luck, really. And magician, well, Orson was into magic, and we talk about one of his films here that involves magic tricks, so to speak. We also would probably say that he was a magician in the sense that he certainly had a bit of magic in terms of his radio career, theatre career, writing skills, directing skills, and acting skills. So he was quite a guy, really. And in this part, we go from a famous film that he acted in 1949, and then we go to the end of his life. And without giving too much away, just speculate a bit on what his legacy is. Was he a sad character? Could he have done more? Or had he already done more than enough as it is? For those who don't know my other podcast work, I have two other podcasts, Glass Onion on John Lennon and Life and Life Only. And I do consider, to quote John Lennon, that the three are all part of the same work. They're one piece of work, and there's quite a bit of overlap with them. Now, I just want to direct you to a few episodes if you're interested. So if you like this deep dive on Orson, we have done on Film Gold 2 previous deep dives. So Marlon Brando, that's episode 11 and 12, and those shows had Ghosty on them as a guest. We also did Michael Caine last year, episodes 22 and 23 with Scott Phipps, who's another of my podcast regulars. If you like Ghosty and I's casual chemistry, that's a phrase we came up with during one of his previous appearances. He was on Glass Onion episodes 57 to 59. We did a fairly epic three-parter there about John Lennon and Elvis, and then on the same podcast, Glass Onion, episodes 69 and 70, where we took listener questions in audio form about the Beatles and John Lennon, and then episodes 90 to 92, where we looked at the year of 1962, and then the Beatles and John Lennon's part in it. So plenty to get into there if you're interested. If you'd like to help out the show, there are links in the show notes to PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. Otherwise, just please share links and tell others about the show. There's no spoken outro to this show. I'll just let it play out at the end of the conversation. Not sure when the next show will be exactly, but sometime soon I will be doing a review of a very famous Orson film. Probably don't even need to tell you if I told you it was the most famous one. That'll be out sometime in the future. But for now, enjoy this episode, and I'll see you soon. So let's get to The Third Man. I'm going to go first here because The Third Man is right up the top of my flick chart. I've got nearly 1,600 films on there now. I don't know where it is exactly. It's about number 20 or something. And we reviewed this. I was on a film review podcast. We did this. I think a lot of people, if they didn't know better, would think that this was directed by Orson. And it does feel, if that phrase means anything, it does feel a bit like a Welles film. I don't know, maybe you can tell if he had any influence, but the things that stand out, I mean, that entrance, you get the cat, and then you're in the doorway, yes, and that smile he has on his face. I mean, I could just watch that 1,000 times. I don't know how you can do that. You know, did Carol Reed say, can you give us a kind of impish smile, or does Orson just have that ready and available to use at all times? Talk about that for a bit, and then I do want to mention the other famous scene. What about Third Man?
Well, I don't think Orson encouraged the idea that he would have directed that film, but I know that some film historians have said, oh, he must have, but there's no evidence to suggest that he did, and, you know, to take it away from Carol Reed just seems petty. But, yeah, it's one of the great entrances in film history. I mean, you couldn't really get any better. Maybe it's because, you know, you've got Joseph Cotten there and Orson Welles. Maybe that's why people think that it's an Orson production. But Orson's magnificent in this incredibly small part. I mean, they spend the whole movie talking about him, and then you finally see him, and it lives up to the height. And I think Orson has this, certainly at this time, has this reputation of a guy who is taking money from the studios and maybe not spending it correctly. And he almost has a bit of a con man type of reputation. Undeserved, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think this film sort of plays into that and maybe casts a long shadow. I can tell you that Orson felt that this movie made him into something of a sex symbol. His luck with the ladies increased tremendously because of the Harry Lime character. People thought he was so magnetic and wonderful. In fact, it even inspired a radio series, which was a prequel series called The Many Lives of Harry Lime.
Yeah, I did listen to a couple of episodes of that, and I don't know how much of it is Orson, but he's just so effortless. Again, impish is probably the word I'd use.
Yes.
The whole way he says things, it's almost like, I'm a bit of a trickster, but, you can't help liking me. He just pulls that off so well. And there's a couple of stories. Like I said, we did a review a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago now. Yeah, there were stories of he was hanging around in hotel rooms doing magic tricks for guests and things, and it was hard to entice him out of the hotel room. That's the story anyway. I haven't heard any really terrible stories about this, but I've always said that movies give you the license to like the bad guy, because it's not real. You've got a license. And of course, it's not that I side with Harry Lime, but I mean, I've never been a kind of person who, if someone's doing something despicable in a film, I suddenly feel like offended somehow, because it's only a film. It's not happening in real life. The other famous scene, of course, is on a Ferris wheel, isn't it? I'll just play the clip, and we think that he actually did write this. I wouldn't call it a speech, but these lines.
Old man, you never should have gone to the police, You ought to leave this thing alone.
Have you ever seen any of your victims?
Victims? Don't be melodramatic. Look down there. Would you really feel any pity if one of those dots stopped moving forever? If I offered you 20,000 pounds for every dot that stopped, would you really, old man, tell me to keep my money? Or would you calculate how many dots you could afford to spend? Free of income tax, old man.
A lot of good your money will do you in jail.
That jail's in another zone. There's no proof against me. Besides you. Don't think they'd look for a bullet wound after you hit that ground. Holly, what fools we are, talking to each other this way, as though I'd do anything to you. Or you to me. You're just a little mixed up about things in general. Nobody thinks in terms of human beings. Governments don't. Why should we? They talk about the people and the proletariat. I talk about the suckers and the mugs. It's the same thing. They have their 5-year plans. So have I.
You used to believe in God.
Well, I still do believe in God, old man. I believe in God and mercy and all that, but the dead are happier dead. They don't miss much here, poor devils. What do you believe in? Oh, if you ever get Anna out of this mess, be kind to her. I think you'll find she's worth it. I wish I'd asked you to bring me some of these tablets from home. Holly, I'd like to cut you in, old man. There's nobody left in Vienna I can really trust, and we've always done everything together. When you make up your mind, send me a message. I'll meet you any place, any time. And when we do meet, old man, it's you I want to see. Not the police. Remember that, won't you? Don't be so gloomy. After all, it's not that awful. Well, what the fella said. In Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. So long, Holly.
And Orson Welles and Joe Cotton obviously play so well together. There's just something, there's a bit of magic whenever they're together. You've also got the Dutch angles in the film. One of the things I absolutely love about the film, and I checked with the guys I did this review, and maybe you can confirm this, there's not supposed to be subtitles for the German, is that right?
Oh, I don't. That's something I never even looked into. I never even.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there isn't. And the glorious thing about it is that you don't need them. just those voices, those German actors have got just fantastic voices. And, if I ever go abroad and they're speaking in a foreign language that I don't know, I just love listening to it because in a way you're not distracted by worrying about what they're talking about. You know what I mean? You can just enjoy the accents. Of course, the elephant in the room, for me as a musician, is the Anton Karas's music.
Yes.
Oh my God, I love this. I really do. And people have got to remember it's not just, da-da-da-da-da, da-da. There's lots of other music in it, and a lot of it is very, very melancholy. There's a real sadness to this film. And again, don't want to spoil the ending, but...
Oh, what a wonderful ending. Everything about this is a classic, yeah.
Yeah, and it's another one, as we were saying before, it got better as we were reviewing it, because we were just, there's three of us, and we were just bouncing off each other, so, yeah, just fantastic. I haven't got the stats with me, but I did some research into the sewers of Vienna, and you wouldn't believe how big they are. I think it's hundreds of kilometres.
Yeah, I can believe it.
Yeah. Anything else you want to say about The Third Man? Or?
No, other than just go see it if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, I mean, you and I could do whole podcasts on, Citizen Kane, The Third Man, and a couple of others that are coming up.
Yes.
So we're just giving a little taste to people who haven't seen them. I think next up, we're back to Shakespeare. So we've got Othello. Just to say, I've seen the Olivier version of Othello, and obviously Olivier's a great actor, but I just think he looks a bit ridiculous. Just being blunt there. I've seen Orson's version maybe twice, and I just watched it again recently, but in that arena thing that you sent me, really good documentary, the two bits that stood out there, because of the budget, apparently the costumes have been impounded, is that right? So this
seems to be a theme, a theme running through.
Well, there's so many themes,
career,
to do with him trying to get money, the studios butchering his films. It's just one after another, almost to the point we don't need to keep making the same point. But but there's he had the idea of having a fight scene in a Turkish bath.
Yes.
So they're just wearing a towel or a loincloth or whatever it would be. And then you've got fight scene, I think you mentioned this earlier, started in Morocco and ended in Italy several months later.
Yes. It's a movie that even though when they put out a new restored version, and this is closer to Orson's original idea, etc., it always seems so choppy. I mean, the editing really kills this movie for me. The editing and the dubbing are a big problem. And it's one of those situations where the production of the film is more interesting than the film itself. So the stories behind it, I would love to read a book about just filming Othello with the actors stranded in hotels as Orson would run off to do a film to get more money to fund his own projects. I mean, we haven't really talked about it too much, but by this time he's really become an independent filmmaker. So he's struggling to get these things completed, and it's just a mess. It really is a mess. Like Macbeth has its problems too, but at least Macbeth feels complete. This feels like 10 different movies happening on 10 different continents being edited together with dubbing trying to cover a lot of mistakes. And it's maybe a masterclass on how to just get something finished under ridiculous circumstances.
Yeah. But again, as we were saying earlier, with The Stranger, I'd probably put it, I don't know, so different, isn't it, to The Stranger, The Lady from Shanghai. But again, there's just enough in there that if you watch it, even just once all the way through, there's a few bits that you'll remember. And I'm a bit biased because Othello is my favourite Shakespeare play. So, don't know, not much more to say about that. I think it's on one of the documentaries they mentioned that obviously Othello is a play to some extent about paranoia. Obviously, Iago's planting the idea that Desdemona is being unfaithful. And someone made the point that, this is around the McCarthy era, so I suppose there's a little bit of a connection there. Another one of his slightly tall tales, he said something about he was keeping all the actors in 5-star hotels or fancy hotels. Not sure about that. Maybe he was just keeping them in normal hotels, and he's just embellishing that story a little bit. Right, just acting-wise, he was in Moby Dick, that we mentioned Moby Dick earlier. A question you asked earlier about is, well, we were talking about activists, weren't we? We were comparing Billy Bragg, who's very consistent, with John Lennon, who's less consistent. But again, there's enough. He's got that. He plays a priest in Moby Dick. He's got that famous scene. Moby Dick is a fantastic book. It's a very, very strange book because you've got lots of chapters all about whaling. in between the chapters of the story of Ahab. You know, nowadays with YouTube, you can just watch that scene.
Right.
That version of Moby Dick's a bit weird, isn't it, with Gregory Peck? Not sure I'm totally convinced with that, but...
Yeah, even the
scene.
famous scene where he's delivering the speech, I know that is one of those speeches that gets singled out as one of the great speeches in film, and I'm just not that impressed with the performance.
Right.
I mean, it's okay. I just feel like his makeup is so ridiculous in that.
Yeah. Okay, so there's one that you wanted to talk about that I don't know anything about, Mr. Akkadin. So tell us about that one.
Yeah, Orson considered this his worst movie. And I agree. There are some interesting ideas in this. It's an attempt at a comedy with a storyline that's kind of similar to Citizen Kane. Evidently, Orson had written the script or had done an adaptation of this script, and it was serialized. He gave it to someone at a French newspaper who translated it into French and published it in serialized form. And then that was collected into a book and sold as a novel by Orson Welles. And then it was then translated from the French into English. And for years was sold as this novel that Orson wrote, which he did not write. He did not write this novel. The movie is this strange comedy film that's just more odd than funny. I get the feeling that Orson's probably not, he was never really somebody you could imagine putting out a comedy. This is the closest, I guess, you get to that. There are scenes where I think there's a scene with a plane and it's going upside down. It's been a long time since I've seen it. I know this is another movie that was hacked to death. I think it was close to 2 hours, then it got maybe an 80-minute running time. And sadly, it was also one of those movies that was in the public domain and was sold alongside with The Stranger. So everywhere you went, this was the movie you were going to see. If you're going to walk into a video store and see an Orson Welles movie, it was going to be this one.
In a word, is it just about worth watching once?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's like a lot of these. It's always worth watching once. I guess because a lot of these movies are compromised in some way. It's kind of like an unfinished album. It's like the Beach Boys' Smile album. You can listen to it and go, okay, here are the pieces of something that could have been great. So if we just listen to the pieces of this, we can sort of imagine what could have been. And I think you kind of do the same or have to do the same with some of these movies.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. I do get that with albums a lot. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but yeah. All right. Touch of Evil.
Well, I have no complaints about this one.
Again, another theme. We're finding these themes, aren't we, of people reconstructing films as close to Orson's vision as possible. And Walter Murch, quite famous editor, he did an edit of this, bought it on DVD a couple of weeks ago. Absolutely loved it. To be honest, I watched it on the same day as The Stranger, and the difference in quality was pretty huge, to be honest. Sometimes when I watch films, because I'm a big diarist, I'll often make a few notes when I'm watching a film and stick them in my diary. I've got a work of art. There's a unique atmosphere to this film, punctuated by the relentless music, great camera work, and I noticed yet overlapping dialogue, which is a trick that a lot of filmmakers do now, which wouldn't have been the norm back in the day. You know, that you wouldn't, people's sentences trip over other people's sentences, which is what people do in real life.
Yeah.
Janet Leigh is the only guest of a motel run by a nervous guy. Sound familiar? That nervous guy is Dennis Weaver, who was in a great Steven Spielberg film called Jewel, which was a TV film which eventually got a theatrical release and is now kind of in the cinema canon as Spielberg's first film, and very much a forerunner to Jaws, because the truck has the same role in the story as the shark would in Jaws. I think the thing I have to say, I was saying earlier about you don't have to hate the bad guy if it's in a film. You know, you can let your dark side, your shadow side out to play. The funny thing about this film is that at the end, I'm crying for Hank Quinlan.
Yeah.
There's something, I don't know what it is. Marlene Dietrich is great as well, but that last scene where they're saying, you know, what about Hank? And she says, he's some kind of a man. You hear that honky tonk piano?
Oh God!
And I've got this thing for honky tonk pianos as well.
His famous intuition was right after all. He framed that Mexican kid Sanchez, but he didn't even need to. The kid confessed about that bomb. So, turns out Quinlan was right after all.
Isn't somebody going to come and take him away?
Yeah, in just a few minutes. You really liked him, didn't you?
The cop did. The one who killed him. He loved him.
Well, Hank was a great detective, all right.
And a lousy cop.
Is that all you have to say for him?
He was some kind of a man. What does it matter what you say about people?
Goodbye, Tanner.
Adios.
And she says, what does it matter what people say about people anyway? And just that last scene, I don't know. I cried for Hank Quinlan. How about that?
Yeah. That could be the title of your memoir.
Yeah. But tell us about what's Orson doing there in that characterization that's so special?
Well, he's making a corrupt cop sympathetic. Actually, Quinlan's instincts are correct as the way the film turns out. So he wasn't that terrible of a cop. But everything about this is wonderful. That opening shot is a classic. The scenes with Marlene Dietrich, especially the drunken Hank Quinlan, tell me my future. You haven't got the future. It's all used up. Oh, my God. Everything about this is wonderful. Even Hank Quinlan's second in command, who's so loyal to him. That character is just, there's nothing I can see. Even that hotel scene with Janet Leigh, the gang, Mercedes McCambridge in that, it's just a classic. I know that for years that wasn't the case. People didn't really think too much of this movie. It was maybe whispered about in cineast circles, but now people really do single out Touch of Evil. Maybe it's with the rise in popularity of the film noir genre. Maybe that's why Touch of Evil has risen to this wonderful, status that it now has. Orson tells a funny story about that. The makeup, yes, Orson was a big man, but he was wearing a padded suit when he was doing this, and a bulbous nose and everything. And he tells a story that he was going to a dinner after filming, and he didn't have time to take the makeup off. And he just went to the dinner in the makeup, and everybody said, "Oh, Orson, you look great. How you doing?"
Oh, yeah, I heard that, yeah. That's funny, isn't it? Yeah, on the makeup, it's funny, isn't it? Because we were saying earlier with Citizen Kane, the makeup's pretty bad, and Moby Dick. For this, it does look pretty fake to me. But in a funny way, I was in quite a philosophical mood when I was watching this a couple of weeks ago. And I was thinking it's almost like you could take that nose, and because the makeup's so fake, you could just take that nose and remove it easily. Mm-hmm. And it's almost as if the character is so broken, is so beyond repair, that you could tear bits off him. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's just that sort of sense I got. A couple of other things to say. I don't rate Charlton Heston at all as an actor. I think he's more wooden than this table that I've got my notes on today. But I love him in this film. I think he's really, really good. It appears from these documentaries that Charlton Heston seemed to like Orson, didn't he? And he said something. Orson was going to write it, and they said to Charlton Heston, "We're looking for a director." And he says, "Well, Orson's not a bad director. Why don't you get him?" Right. The studio loved the rushes but hated the rough cut, did their own version. Orson famously wrote a 58-page memo to the head of the studio, and as I mentioned earlier, Walter Murch then, I guess it's using the memo as a brief, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. Re-edited it. So how many different versions of this film are there?
I think there's 3 now. Okay. I think what we have now is maybe the most or the closest to Orson's original vision. It's funny, something Orson said sometime in the 80s before he died, which is eerie. He said, "You watch, the minute I'm dead, they're going to find all the footage that was missing, and they're going to be able to put together these projects." He's like, "I won't be around to see it." And in this case, it's true. And I think we do have, pretty close approximation of what Orson wanted with the trial. I think the first version I saw was just the release version, which was great enough. I didn't have any problem with that either. I already loved that. But Orson said, the studio just they felt it was too strange, or something about it just rubbed them the wrong way. He said in Europe, however, it played for years in theaters. It was always coming back. But in America, they buried it.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I suppose it's just ahead of its time, isn't it? I said I like old films, but I often say, as I was saying earlier with The Stranger, there's certain traits of old films that I can't always get past, but this doesn't seem to have any of that. I mean, this seems like a fairly modern film to me. I could see it as it feels a bit like maybe the Coen brothers at their best. You know, if they'd made this film, 30 years later.
Yeah.
More than that, 40 years later. Yeah, I think it's an absolute classic. I love it. Oh, there was a little touch, wasn't there, in the opening credits? What was it? They removed the credits, didn't they? Because someone was saying,
yes.
if you put the credits up there, you know nothing bad's going to happen. But if you remove the credits, there's always a chance that something bad will happen. Was that the quote, wasn't it?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, something like that. So obviously not consciously in the viewer, but, subconsciously.
Great music, too, all throughout this movie.
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah, I love it. And again, I was comparing The Stranger to Notorious. The same year as this would be Vertigo, which we said earlier is now apparently the best film ever. But I never rated that particularly highly.
No, it's not even the best Hitchcock.
No, and I'd
even
take
close.
this over that. All right, next up is The Trial. Now, we'll let you into a little bit of a secret. We were originally going to do this as a review, and then it's funny the way these things work out. We said, let's do The Trial, and we could talk a bit about Orson. Of course, that's evolved into now just 3 hours talking about Orson. Hey.
With a little bit about The Trial.
With 5 minutes on The Trial, yeah. Now, there's one interesting thing. I don't know where this came from, but you mentioned one of the parts that your favourite film of all time is A Hard Day's Night.
Yes.
Now, I haven't seen The Trial for years, is there some sort of scene where he's in a room of some kind, there's some bars and there's girls kind of grabbing at the bars?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know who came up with this. It wasn't me. I wish it was. Perhaps I can just lie and say, yeah, it was actually me. Someone made a connection between that and the scenes in A Hard Day's Night when they're on the train and they're pulling at Ringo's hair. That's a brilliant connection. I'll have to find out who. I think it was probably one of my jobs, because I have a few different gigs outside my teaching. One of them is a job where it's sometimes very slow, but I've got the internet. And I could spend long hours researching podcasts. I think it came from there. It was someone talking about that. But so it's based on the Kafka book. I haven't read the Kafka book. Why don't you go first, and then I'll just fill in a couple of bits I noticed.
I love this movie. I mean, for me, this is top-tier Orson Welles. I think the approach that Orson took to this movie, because The Trial, the Kafka novel, which I did read many, many years ago when I was probably a teenager, you're supposed to feel this real sympathy for Joseph K. He's this man caught in this sort of strange labyrinth of red tape. He doesn't really deserve to be there. And Orson, he told Anthony Perkins this. We just got through talking about Janet Leigh in a hotel, and here we are with Anthony Perkins. He told,
oh, yeah. God, I didn't even notice that.
He told Anthony Perkins, Joseph K's guilty. And Anthony Perkins like, what? It's like, this is a real radical interpretation of this book. What is he guilty of? And Orson said, of everything. So that's the way Perkins plays this. And that's one of the things I enjoy about it, because when you watch it, I mean, he's protesting his innocence, and yet there's something about Perkins that, as the viewer, I just don't trust him at all. Right. I don't like what's happening around him, but there's really no one to root for in this movie, but it's just wonderful. Of course, Orson's in it in a small part, and the actress Jean Moreau. Yeah, I can't pronounce it. Is it Jean Moreau? Is that how you say it? Jean Moreau, yes, with the webbed fingers. I mean, there's so many things in this movie. I mean, we talked about surrealism creeping in. This is big-time surrealism, and I just love this movie, just as an experience. I just love it.
Yeah, I've probably seen it actually about 4 or 5 times over the years, but stretched over a number of years. And because I recognise the first time I watched it, there's too many details here to fully absorb it. You really need to watch it a few times, definitely. I mean, I have no trouble with what might be called bleak films, but the first time I watched this, I think I watched this quite young as well. I think the bleakness did kind of get to me a little bit, but then that's sort of become what I love about it. And, Anthony Perkins is so unique, and
Yeah.
I'd completely forgotten, that he worked with Janet Leigh just before Psycho and then Perkins just after. That's very neat. I love that. The other thing was another film review podcast I appear on. We did Eraserhead, and the soundscape is so similar.
Yes,
Yes. Also Elephant Man, David Lynch as well. 100% would have taken it from here. I don't know if you mentioned it, but, I'm sure you wouldn't dispute that.
No.
Yeah, and those scenes where he's going through the offices, this is the bit I remember, and the typing. There's very loud typing sounds, and the echo that's on there and everything. And obviously it's a film about, on one level, the unstoppable bureaucracy and how the law is an absolute minefield if you're not a lawyer. Because in my kind of alternative media kind of awakening from about 2007, I did definitely watch this again in that period, and I saw it through a very fresh pair of eyes. The bureaucracy and the law. Mm-hmm. But I'd never registered that thing about him being guilty until I watched that Orson, one of the ones you sent me a few weeks ago. But yeah, it definitely demands lots of viewing. It is pretty bleak. I think if you're in a certain mood, perhaps it's not the film. Would you agree?
I was going to say, I didn't use that word, but you're absolutely correct. It is an incredibly bleak film, especially the ending, which is just, bleak.
Yeah. Quite,
but I love it.
Well.
I just love it. I love everything about this film. I love the set pieces. I love, like you said, the office with the typing, the scenes in the law offices. I haven't seen this in a while, but I want to say it's the courts. It's like a whole group of old men who are sort of in the galleys, and it's like a nightmare. It's this nightmare vision. It's almost like, when you see on TikTok or Instagram, these folks have used AI to create these sort of strange retro nightmare landscapes. Well, this is really it. I think this is what they're shooting for. It's all here.
This is what I was saying. Yeah, I mean, if for people who are thinking of watching it, don't watch it if you're in a bit of a fragile mood or you're feeling a bit depressed, because it's not gonna uplift you.
No,
let's be honest. But it's a work of art. I did want to ask you one thing. I haven't seen it for years, but Orson's character, which I think is just called the Advocate, he's very low energy. And again, this was another thing like with Brando when we talked about. How much of that is intentional and how much of that is laziness that did creep into Orson? What do you think?
I think it's intentional because he's full of pep in the next movie. So I think that's just the way he's playing it. I mean, yes, he's like at this point obese. So he's probably, I don't know, he's got so much energy in the next film that it's a completely different type of performance. So I think it was intentional.
All right. So yeah, recommendation for that one, especially if you're a film student. Oh my God, you'll be all over this, won't you?
Oh yeah.
Film student stream. So what was the next one what's the next one on our
Chimes
list?
at Midnight.
Chimes at Midnight, yeah, 1965. This is a mixture of 2 or 3 plays, because the Falstaff character is in 3 plays. Henry IV, Part 1, Part 2, and then The Merry Wives of Windsor. Yeah, go on. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's this recurring theme. I guess it's in Shakespeare, but it's in Orson's work too. Orson really had this preoccupation with the idea of growing old and feeling useless, sort of being on the outs with society, and well, certainly on the outs with Hollywood at this point, and the outs with his benefactors. And I think that's reflected in this movie. I mean, I think that Chimes at Midnight is a film that's kind of getting its due over the years. This is another one that's been restored, and a new print has come out, and it was a movie that was very hard to find for many years. Usually with every Orson Welles film, there's one particular sequence that sticks with people, and in this, it's the battle. The grisly battle sequence, which features this comical aspect of Falstaff in armor, this rotund guy running across the field in this feeble attempt to join in. Of his Shakespeare movies, it's probably, it's the most where he's taken the source material and ran with it and created something new. But I guess it's the most successful of the 3.
Yeah, this one is rated very highly. I think Wells said, if he could only, he could only give one film to the gods or something like that.
Right.
It would be this one. I've seen it twice. I don't rate it as highly as some people. But I would say that I think the Falstaff connection, because Falstaff is a classic Shakespeare character, it seems very close to Orson. I hate to keep using this word tragic, because we're going to sort of end with that later on. Was he a tragic character or not? But I think there's a clear identification there. You know, that Falstaff is a character who is physically, I guess he's obese. He's a flawed character. I mean, who isn't a flawed character?
Right.
But he's got lots and lots of great lines, and he's a great sort of raconteur. And in the Henry IV plays, he's in the pub with his mates getting drunk, but sort of teaching everyone a lesson in how to enjoy life almost. Right. It's that kind of thing. Very good.
Yeah, we've seen this character, because it does become like an archetype, and we've seen the Falstaff character in so many other movies that have nothing to do with anything we're talking about. I'm thinking of the movie My Own Private Idaho. Did you ever see that movie with Keanu Reeves and River? Yeah, there's a Falstaff. They might call him that, actually, in the movie, but it's obviously based on that character. Anyway.
I think that is classed as a Shakespeare adaptation, but it's like
one that they've...
Yeah, it's like there's a really good basketball film called O, which was loosely based on Othello. That's one thing I've really enjoyed in recent years, is the way that people are taking Shakespeare and putting it in all kinds of contexts. Obviously, Orson was doing that 80 years ago now. It's unbelievable. I think he definitely was a visionary, if nothing else. I think he had a good handle on human nature and things like that, and he was just way ahead of his time in so many ways, I think. I think there's two more I'd like to talk about. F for Fake. Absolutely love it. I think you do as well, yeah.
Yeah.
I absolutely love it. I've written here, it's kind of Orson's autobiography. Not exactly, but what we were saying earlier, it's this fine line between what's fake and what isn't, and it's about the suspension of disbelief. But it's got all kinds of levels. I just listened to... Do you ever listen to Projection Booth podcast?
No.
It's a good one, yeah. And they did a 2-hour one on F for Fake. How many times have you seen this, and when was the first time you saw this?
Many times. I saw this probably in the 90s. There was a video store in Piermont, New York, called Piermont Pictures, which was known throughout the country as one of the top video rental stores in the United States. It was a video store where famous people would come and rent movies. And anyway, they had everything. No matter what you wanted, no matter how obscure, they had it. And F for Fake, at that time, I don't think it even enjoyed a home video release, but they had a copy of it somehow. And I thought it was fantastic. This is, we talk about being ahead of your time. I think about this now, this sort of film essay where you take, and in this case, Orson took an existing documentary and just expanded upon it. And it's the sort of thing that you see now people do all the time in long form on YouTube, where they're taking existing footage and re-editing it and recontextualizing it. And this is, as far as I know, is the first time this has ever really been done. And yes, he does turn it into, he takes the Clifford Irving story and he does turn it into his own story, because you do get some autobiographical parts to this. And you also get this completely fictitious short film. Well, I've just spoiled it by saying that, but you get a short a short film with his paramour at the time, Oya Kodor, and Picasso. It's great. There's like 5 movies here that I consider top tier, super important films that you must see before you die, and this is one of them.
Of Orson or anyone?
Of Orson.
Of Orson, right. Yeah, I feel like I don't think we should give it anything away, because if anyone's listening to this who hasn't seen it, just see it and love it. Because there's also Howard Hughes weaved in there as well.
Oh, yes, yes.
What's the name of the... is it Elmire?
Yes. Well, Clifford Irving is the guy who faked the Howard Hughes diaries, and then Elmire was the forger.
Oh, that's it. Yeah, the forger.
Yes.
But there's lots of levels to this. So, yeah, if you do watch it and then you want to hear a really good discussion of it, the Projection Booth podcast, very, very good. Somewhere in one of the interviews, Orson said a magician is an actor. And I guess that works the other way. So, again, he's sort of skirting this line, isn't he, between...
Yes.
Because film is essentially magic in a way, in the sense that a good director will divert your attention in one direction and then possibly, put something else in the film. And nowadays... don't know about you, but I absolutely love director commentaries and all the DVD extras. You know, I was saying earlier, it really enhanced Citizen Kane for me. I love all that stuff. I love stuff being pointed out that I hadn't noticed.
Right.
And I can go and watch a favourite film again and see all this new stuff. Absolute sucker for that. Last one, again, I feel like I should have watched this, but I didn't get round to it. The Other Side of the Wind.
I also have not watched The Other Side of the Wind.
Right, okay.
I've watched the documentary on the making and restoring of The Other Side of the Wind. I've seen so much of the footage over the years that I feel like I have watched it. And I'm sure that somebody listening to this, how could you do a retrospective on Orson Welles and both of you have not seen The Other Side of the Wind?
Shame on you.
Shame on you, yes. And, you know, we were just playing up the Walter Murch Touch of Evil. Here we have another film that I think Peter Bogdanovich was involved in. Well, I mean, he's in the movie, but he was involved in making sure that this is as close to Orson's cut. I feel like this is such a troubled production, and I struggle with the idea whether it's best left in my imagination as an unfinished film or whether I should actually see it. I don't have any expectations that it's going to be great. So I probably should just watch it. I know I'd have to like sign up for Netflix or something in order to see it, but I just haven't gotten around to watching it. Maybe it's because it's just one of those things that came along after my fandom of Orson Welles ran its course. You know, it had a start date and kind of an end date. Anytime we have these conversations, whether it's Elvis or Brando or Orson Welles or John Lennon, I always feel like I'm talking about these finite periods where I was super into them, and then I've moved on to something else. I take a little bit of them with me, but I'm not actively involved as I used to be.
I know what you mean. I mean, with any character, no matter how fascinating they are, some fatigue will set in. And essentially, you know, when we planned this podcast about a month ago, I spent about 2 weeks in the world of Orson and absolutely loved it. But, you know, it's enough. You know, I had him, to quote John Lennon's Aunt Mimi, you know, I'd had him for breakfast, lunch and dinner for about 2 weeks. It was enough, you know. The only function we can serve in this regard is just to make people aware of this film's existence and to say, you know, that it's out there and you can watch it on our behalf.
That's your job, listener.
Yeah. Right, we are kind of getting towards the end here. I mean, we could talk forever, clearly. Ghosty, would you be prepared to do one Orson impression just for me? I'll give you the line. Right, I'd like to say Carlsberg, probably the best lager in the world, in your best Orson.
Carlsberg, probably the best lager in the world.
At their brewery in Copenhagen, Carlsberg's brewing experts constantly strive to improve and refine their famous lager. But as they consider that Carlsberg is already probably the best lager in the world, they have little hope of success. Oh well, Carlsberg, probably the best lager in the world.
I've seen that commercial. Here in the United States, it would be Paul Masson. We will sell no wine before it's time.
The reason I mentioned that is that I've realised this is a bit of kind of, I don't know, retro memories, but I'm pretty sure the first time I ever heard his voice was that advert, because back in the 80s, you know, people didn't video stuff. I mean, we had a VCR machine from about the late 80s or something, but you tend to watch things, and adverts were quite a thing, you know, the kind of thing you'd talk about the next day at school or whatever.
Right.
You know, because some of them were quite entertaining, and I realised that is probably the first time I heard his voice. So towards the end of his life, again, I'll give you the shorthand and you tell me if it's right, that he was kind of doing stuff almost purely for money, almost like Kenneth Williams. I recommended a documentary about him. I'll put it in the show notes, actually. Not that they're similar, but Kenneth Williams in the end was just dining out on having an endless number of stories, could go on chat shows and would guarantee be a great guest. Towards the end of Orson's life, he died in 85. Was it a sad end? What would you say about maybe the last 10 years? Is there any way of summarising that?
I would say that Orson's desire to complete these projects that he had, like Don Quixote, right? That was something that he had been working on for years and years. Even after the lead actor had passed away, he was still thinking about editing this movie and finishing this movie. I wonder how realistic that was. So, I mean, when people think about Orson Welles in the mid-'70s, I guess for the last 10 years of his life, because that's really what we're talking about, we think of him as someone with like several unfinished projects. There's one called The Deep, which was later, I think, remade as a movie with Jacqueline Bisset, if I'm not mistaken. There was another one called The Big Brass Ring. There were these other movies that he was working on sporadically, using money that he would get from acting jobs, which at this point really were voiceover jobs for trailers and commercials, and then whatever money he would make appearing on talk shows. Because I hate to spoil it for people, but guests do get paid to appear on these talk shows. Yeah. And he would appear on a number of them, usually doing magic tricks. He was on the Merv Griffin Show, the Mike Douglas Show, Dick Cavett. He was on all of these programs. And Orson at this point had... Actually, he always had this gift of being a raconteur, but by this point he had amassed so many stories and could talk about anybody you named, really, in Hollywood, that he was the ideal talk show guest because he was very articulate, he was funny, he had a million stories, maybe 70% of them were true, the other ones were embellished quite a bit. But it just saddens me to think that he was so obsessed with these projects that he would take these other jobs that are beneath him just to make money. There is a famous outtake, and I shared it with you recently, the series of commercials he did for frozen peas and other frozen dinners, where Orson is getting very testy in the recording booth. And this is where Antony cuts to a clip of that right now.
We know a remote farm in Lincolnshire where Mrs. Buckley lives. Every July, peas grow there. We aren't even in the fields, you see.
Yeah, we aren't.
We're talking about them growing, and she's picked them.
Yeah.
On what?
In July.
I don't understand you, then. What must be over for July?
When we get out of that snowy field.
When I was out, we were onto a can of peas, a big dish of peas when I said in July.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, always.
In July.
I'm always past that.
You are?
Yes. Why, that's about where I say in July.
Could you emphasize a bit in July?
Why? That doesn't make any sense. There's no known way of saying an English sentence in which you begin a sentence with in and emphasize it. That's just stupid. In July. I'd love to know how you emphasize in July. Impossible. Meaningless.
I think all they were thinking about was that they didn't want to...
He isn't thinking.
Wilson, can we just do one last...
Yeah?
And it was my fault. I said in July. If you can leave every July...
You didn't say it. He said it.
It's every July.
Your friend.
Fractionally.
Every July? No, you don't really mean every July.
It is.
But that's bad copy. It's in July. Of course it's every July. There's too much directing around here.
Could I have one more go, Orson, please? Sorry.
What?
Could I have just one more take of that?
Why? I just did it right.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not used to having more than one person in there. One more word out of you and you go. Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Take directions from one person under protest. But from two, I don't sit still. But who the hell are you, anyway?
No, I'm the engineer.
Well, why the hell are you asking me for another one?
Well, I thought there was a slight bonk, and I would just like to be safe.
Jesus.
I can tell you, from my experience, also as a voice actor and also working on a lot of projects that are beneath me, that...
Not including this one, obviously.
Not including this, goddamn. But I also have been in situations where I am very sympathetic to Orson, because sometimes you do work with people who ask you to do really ridiculous and impossible things. But for this great man who had done so much and had so much potential, for him to be reduced to doing this for money so he could fund his own projects, because you kind of wish, I used to have this fantasy that some multimillionaire would come along and just write him a check. I almost feel like he should have gotten a grant, like the National Endowment of the Arts should have given him $6 million to finish whatever he needed to finish.
Just to say, you could imagine him doing a GoFundMe nowadays.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
if anybody.
millions.
Oh my God,
Oh,
it would
yeah.
be. He would be. It's too bad that didn't exist. Instead, he was holed up in this tiny apartment in Hollywood, waiting for Burt Reynolds to call, and hoping that Burt Reynolds would agree to appear in a movie. That's how he would get funding for it. This last chapter of Orson's life, these last 10 years, are pretty well documented. I mean, there's the Henry Jaglom book, My Lunches with Orson, I think it's called. There are a number of interviews. I mean, there's some positive stuff too, because he was being celebrated by film buffs. That was really starting to become its own thing, the film community and film fans, and he was celebrated primarily for Citizen Kane.
Yeah.
I think these other movies, I think Touch of Evil would later have their day after he passed. And so he enjoyed that. He traveled the world appearing at film festivals and giving lectures and talks. That's fine. But I wonder about these unfinished projects. I wonder how serious he was about these unfinished projects.
I think there were certain ones. Don Quixote seemed to, from what I've seen. I think it's just whether he had a connection with them.
But I do wonder if sometimes it's this unfinished project is what's keeping me going, or it's my excuse I'm using to do these other things. I'm not quite sure. I can imagine having that unattainable goal that you're never going to. Well, I guess it's a bit like Don Quixote, really, when you think about it. He's sort of wandering around in a world that he doesn't really belong in anymore.
Someone in that situation could also use it as an excuse to feel very sorry for themselves. So I don't think I didn't really get that sense from the interviews I watched. In terms of interviews, he was on Cavett many times, and I would like to include the clip which I sent you a few months ago, where he turns the tables and starts interviewing Cavett. Here we go.
Could I ask you about your work? Could I interview you? Is that a good idea?
I suppose. Well, I'll tell you.
Is it impertinent? Am I part?
Well, let me tell you, it's frightening to meet a legend, and I know that it must be upsetting for you, too. I know that half your life has been spent wanting to know about me, so shoot.
Well, it seems like that's true, because I've been watching you an awful long time with great pleasure, as millions of other people have been doing. I think that deserves a little applause.
Oh, no.
I'm just trying to work them up. But really, I would like to know more about you, and I bet there are millions of people who don't know much about you except as you appear in the course of your conversation. In other words, the other night on the show, or not the other night, some weeks ago, I heard you say, to my distress, that you had once been an actor.
Ah, yes.
Now, I'm always sorry to hear anybody that I admire has been an actor.
There are those who were more immediately distressed than you were hearing it that night. Yes, I was one of the, in the annals of the theater, probably one of the top 3 second murderers in Richard III.
But was that your only role?
Yes, and unfortunately, it wasn't even in the play Richard III. I was in a repertory thing. This actually happened to me one night. I committed the awful sin of being in repertory and coming out and doing a line from the wrong play. Not just one line, but it certainly...
If you've done that, you're a veteran, because we've all done that.
Have you done that?
Oh, my goodness.
Have you?
Oh, my goodness, yes. We even did a gag of it. Really? At one time, we had a repertory in which we were... our proposition, our idea, was to do tragedy, which was Danton's death, and another night, a farce by La Biche. And we had a famous actor from Middle Europe playing in the tragedy, and he didn't have any part in the farce. But every night of the farce, he used to come in during the big door slamming thing, dressed up as Robespierre, look around and say, "Oh, mistake," and run out again. In the wrong play, you see. But showed the right spirit. Well, in Shakespeare, you go into the wrong lines all the time because of the rhythm.
Sure.
If you stop thinking for a minute, you're in another play.
Very
now, you began as an
movie.
actor? Excuse me if I press on with this.
That's all right. You won't learn anything.
When did you go straight?
While you were asking that question, I think. That startled me. No, I'm kind of a male garbo, Mr. Wells. I like to preserve a great deal of mystery about myself and my
so ends the
origins.
interview?
And that's it. Yep. Oh, my name's up on the screen. We have a message. We'll be right back. Gee, there's so many things.
Excuse me, I don't think we should let you weasel out of this quite so easily.
But I'm thinking of them.
Please. You know, you sit there night after night for 90 minutes at a time, drunk with power,
yes,
pelting people with questions and a few simple little requests for information. And what do we get? You know, the second murderer.
That's right.
Right. Now, what did you do after leaving the boards?
After leaving the boards, well, then I was a comedy writer for a while. I wrote for
That I knew.
Jack Parr and others.
Now, that brings me to a question. You mentioned Jack Parr, and then you say, and others.
Yes, I do.
Who are the others?
I'm learning how to do this. This is very good. Does Jerry Lewis ring a bell?
A rather dim gong.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
You did a very good one with Parkinson. These are all on YouTube, obviously, from 74. Very good interview. There's loads, aren't there? We could sort of say with documentaries, you sent me that Arena one on YouTube as well. And that's essentially an interview as well, isn't it, really?
They're always wonderful. There's no such thing as an Orson Welles interview that is not entertaining, that you're not going to walk away with some pearls of wisdom. It's just...
Yeah.
I mean, just a master raconteur. I could sit and listen to him all day. I would never grow bored. I would also point the listeners toward the direction of what I consider to be the definitive Orson Welles fan site on the internet, which is WellsNet.
Yes.
It also has a presence on Facebook as well. But wellsnet.com, years ago, I don't think this is the case anymore, but years ago, they had a section on, well, I've just pulled it up now. They have some radio on here, well, quite a bit, but years ago they had a pretty substantial collection of his radio work on there, which should keep everybody interested and entertained. So
yeah, I mean, the Orson superfan, particularly if they're, I don't know, a young person who's just starting on the journey. Oh, my God. That's a gift that will keep giving. Just going back to his last few years, Peter Bogdanovich, we've mentioned a few times, said, I think we said this earlier, should have had someone getting the money for Orson while he took care of the art. Charlton Heston said, Orson wants to work but tends to alienate the people with the money. And I guess a psychologist, coffee table or otherwise, would wonder if that wasn't almost done on purpose, antagonise the suits almost.
Right.
Everyone wanted to have lunch with Orson but not give him any money for films. I think that might be a paraphrase, or that might be something Heston said. There's another good documentary, The Magician. I think it's The Extraordinary Life and Career of Orson Welles.
There's also One Man Band, which is about a lot of his unfinished projects.
Oh, right. In short, there's plenty there.
I know that his daughter wrote a wonderful book, and she had a lot of great love for her father and a lot of tremendous adventures with her father. And she really does capture his voice well in that book, better than most books. I mean, deeply flawed like any entertainer that gets wrapped up in show business. I'm not saying they all do this. I mean, Jimmy Stewart didn't seem to have any trouble being a decent husband and father to his kids. But a lot of people just pursue that creative muse and let everything go by the wayside and probably shouldn't have even had children.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Jimmy Stewart, because if you think of the two nice guy actors of that period, I'd probably think of Jimmy Stewart and Henry Fonda. Yeah. And Henry Fonda was married 8 times.
Right.
It's so strange, isn't it? If you saw those two acting, you'd think they're probably quite similar in their personal lives. I had a section here, Brando comparisons. I feel like I've just been talking almost about Brando continuously for a whole conversation. But you did say you didn't mind talking about the weight gain thing, because you'd mentioned on one of the John Lennon ones that you had some struggles there. Of course, the cliche thing is, people put on weight because they're unhappy or whatever. But is there any insights you can give us into Orson or Marlon Brando's weight gain?
Well, I mean, that's probably true. I do think with Orson, so much of his schmoozing and wining and dining in order to get things done and entertaining people revolved around food. So that didn't help either. But then eventually, yes, I mean, it becomes the one thing, certainly maybe the one thing in Orson's life he could control was what he ordered. I know that in less sensitive times, which would have been when Orson was alive in those last 10 years, he was the butt of a lot of jokes regarding that. I don't think that would happen today. And I think people would take a look at his weight gain and associate that with being slovenly or someone who's just self-indulgent, and maybe using that as a way to discount a lot of the great work that he did, which seems ridiculous now, but that might have been the going thought. I know, for example, in my family, whenever he would appear on Mike Douglas, my grandmother would go, "Oh, that fat slob." You know, she just had no time for him at all based on his appearance, which is sad. But, you know, these last years of Orson's life are fascinating for a number of reasons, because there is that tragedy involved. You know, we were asking, is he a tragic figure? There is that tragedy of him trying to get things accomplished. He's left behind all of these works which are in a state of disarray or not quite the way that he originally intended them. They've been compromised in some way. But I will say I don't consider Orson a tragic figure because he had already accomplished more than 90% of the people that certainly I follow and look up to. He was way beyond that. He's already accomplished so much by the time he was 25. I mean, he could have just walked away from it, and that would have been enough. So you have to ask, how much more does he have to do? There's so much material there. There's so much work there. It's just such a, you know, you talk about a labyrinth. There's just so much to go through. I think if you only focus on his film career as a director, you could say that, but that's leaving out so much of what else was important to Orson and so much of his work. Obviously, this is film gold, right? So we're going to focus on his films, but he was so much more than that. And yes, these plays are ephemeral, and we're not going to really know what they were like, or we can only kind of guess, but they were substantial for their time. And certainly the radio stuff exists, and there's just so much there.
Yeah, I was surprised, I have to say. I knew that he'd packed quite a lot in, but I was surprised how much he packed in. And perhaps, you know, everybody has a limit. You know, if you do too much too soon, maybe you just don't quite have enough energy, you know, thinking in terms of the long game, you know?
Yeah.
I'll just carry on with these Brando things because they're quite fascinating. Now, they both had a disillusionment with Hollywood, but Orson was trying to get back in, and Brando seemed to want to be out, even though he enjoyed the money, and he was pretty open about that. He got to make films so he could spend the rest of the year doing what he wanted, apparently. On the weight gain, someone said watching Orson eat was like watching someone making love to food. I wonder if he ate quite gracefully, you know. Perhaps he did. The two of them in interviews, they were both on Dick Cavett. I think they're both fabulous interviews. Brando's for a completely different reason, for these brilliantly uncomfortable / comfortable pauses that they have.
Right.
But also, obviously Orson was a gift to the interview, as you said. They both had the ability to raise a film up. I don't know if we mentioned this earlier. There was a connection with Orson. Obviously nearly made Heart of Darkness. He arguably stole The Third Man, and then exactly 30 years later, Brando arguably stole Apocalypse Now. So you've got that as well. They both seem to have this apparent wisdom. Again, as fans, perhaps we might overplay that. Who knows? I mean, that's what fans do, isn't it? But it seems to be, they both seem to have a fairly good handle on human nature and obviously the way that Hollywood works. We don't know they ever met, do we?
That's a good question. I would think they would have had to have run into each other at some point. I mean, it's just impossible to... Hollywood's a small town. They would have had to have run into each other. I know Brando met Bob Hope, so why wouldn't he have met Orson Welles, you know?
I obviously Googled both of their names and didn't come up with anything, and I was trying to think of times when they might be in the same place making films, but I couldn't find anything. All I could find was that in that famous Connie Chung interview from '89, Marlon just mentions Orson in passing. He's talking about American theatre.
Right.
So if they met, do you think they would have enjoyed each other's company? if only to compare, bad childhoods. What do you think?
It probably would have been a very strained conversation, because I can't imagine either of them relinquishing the role of being the center of attention. So I can't imagine. Somebody has to listen to the other person, and I can't imagine either one of them doing that.
Yeah, if I was there, I would have the recorder ready and think, well, I'll probably get about 45 minutes of gold before they start to hate each other. On the John Lennon show, we talked about when they met Elvis, obviously, and then I talked about with Ben Burrow about when they met Dylan, and the egos seemed to sort of match somehow. But yeah, they would have had a bizarre conversation, but they probably would have allowed the conversation to go in very bizarre directions. So
yes,
that would have been worth recording, I think. When Dan Richter was on Glass Onion, we talked about Kubrick and Lennon, and I said, as I just did with you, I sort of said, well, would they get on if they'd met? And then I found out, just from this Kubrick documentary, they did actually meet. He had lunch with John and Paul to talk about this Lord of the Rings film. He was going to direct the Beatles in Lord of the Rings.
Oh, well, there you go. Well, maybe with this, maybe they both went to bed with the same Hollywood starlet.
Oh, yeah. Well, Brando and Wells could have definitely compared a few notes, couldn't they?
That's what they would have talked about.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. I'm just going to end with, I think there's a line in Chimes of Midnight, Falstaff is dead, and it's in the Shakespeare play. And I just can't help thinking that when Orson died, they would have said something like, Orson is dead, because he was this big figure, He was a bit like Falstaff and a bit like King Lear, and there perhaps was a bit of tragedy, but I think you made a very good point there that there's enough great work that it really doesn't matter. And especially now it's been 40 years since he's gone, and he's now existing in this kind of afterlife, which, Brando and Elvis and John Lennon and all those other people, they're in now. It's an afterlife where they're alive forever, but you can look at their work and not get tangled up necessarily in what was happening around the time, although that's interesting as well. As you said, the making of some of these films is as interesting as the film. So let me give you the closing words.
Wow, you put me on the spot.
Oh, yeah.
I think I kind of already said it. Yeah. I would say that Orson's reputation has only grown since he's passed away. I mean, I think he's celebrated more now than he certainly was in 1985. So I think it's just going to continue to be that way. And it's the same with these other people we've talked about. Elvis gets bigger after he's gone, Lennon certainly. And it's the same story, like you said. You have the last word. You had the last word. You summed it up beautifully with they're in that afterlife where they are going to live forever. These films aren't going to go anywhere. So Hank Quinlan will die as many times as you need him to.
Yeah. And I think when there's real substance there, which there clearly is with all those people you just mentioned, it will grow. And more stuff will be uncovered. I mean, every now and again I go to YouTube and I plug in Beatles interview or John Lennon interview or something, and every now and again, or Brando, that 2-hour one popped up a few years ago, didn't it? The Studs Terkel one. They'll keep popping up. Stuff will keep emerging, and the legend will grow. And I think that's all we have to say, really. There's plenty of other stuff we could say, but this has been epic again. I'm pretty sure this is going to go out in 3 parts.
I think I predicted that.
Yeah, well, based on previous form, whenever you've come on any of my shows. Well, yeah, with Brando, I think I just put it in 2 long parts, but I'm milking it now a bit more, so I want to get more episodes out. But yeah, thank you very much. Your podcast is We Say Yeah. And can you watch Other Side of the Wind, please?
Never. The audience, yes. You guys watch it. You let us know. Tell us if it's worth it.
Yeah, please. If there's any that we haven't seen, or there's anything that we haven't said that you want to say, put them in the comments section or send me an email.
I also have a book on the making of The Other Side of the Wind. This is crazy. I have a book that's just on the making of that film. You'd think I would have seen it.
This could go on forever. It could be like what about the making of the making of?
Right. We're going to do the making of this podcast.
Yeah, because our friend, that Martin Quibell, Marv, he's got Pods Like Us. He was interviewed about his podcast. So a podcast about podcasts was interviewing another podcast about podcasts that they've reviewed. Anyway, yes, in closing, so Orson's work will live on, and presumably the internet stays roughly the way it is. It's a gift that just keeps giving, and for anyone who's listened to this conversation who's maybe doesn't know his work, it's a hell of a journey you've got ahead of you, eh? And on that note, I'm going to say thank you once again, Ghosty, and sure we'll do some podcast activity this will be a good few months getting this out. So,
Right. Yeah.
And thanks to the listeners for listening, and there'll be more content soon. Goodbye.
Are there any things about you that you would change now? Anything about the way you've lived your life? The
Almost
things that
everything.
you've done? Really?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Don't you have pride in what you've done?
I never understand those people who say I have no regrets. It's incomprehensible to me.
What are you?
Mine are as countless as the sands of the desert. You know, I can't imagine not having a regret about almost everything.
What are some of your big regrets?
Big regrets? Oh, I suppose that I fell in love with movies. You know, you can fall in love with a girl and have her ruin your life. And I fell in love with movies, and I have done less in my life than I would have if I hadn't.
What would you have done had you not fallen in love with movies?
I don't know, but something that didn't take so much time and cost so much in money and energy and everything else. I can't change this condition of love, but I think I would be better off without it.